and welcome to this forum panel on artificial intelligence, opportunities and risk for development. My name is Vincent Boulanin. I'm senior researcher at SIPRI and will be the moderator of this session. So allow me to start with a few words of introduction about today's topic and about how that session will pan out. So information and communication technology, ICT, has been transforming societies around the globe for decades now. Many of us can personally relate to the successive transformation that ICT brought in our daily lives. If you're like me, older than 30 and from a rich country, you may remember when your school, or if you were lucky, your family acquired its first personal computer in the 90s. You may also remember the democratization of high-speed internet in the 2000s, which allowed you and the rest of society around you to make a truly useful use of the internet. You also may have numerous anecdotes about how smartphones and social media transform your social life in the 2010s. Today, if you are asked what digital transformation characterize our day and age, you will likely say Zoom meetings and also perhaps artificial intelligence, AI. AI already is affecting our lives, and society will continue to doing so in the years to come. So today you may associate AI with online recommendations, and you will continue to doing and facial and voice recognition features on your phone. And a few years from now, you may associate it with major transformation in the health sector, for instance, with the progress of personalized and predictive medicine, in the education sector with the advance of personalized education programs, in the transportation and logistics sector with the democratization of self-driving cars and drone package delivery, and in the manufacturing and food industry with the robotization, automation of the workforce. So certainly my personal experience and understanding of the positive and negative changes that ICT has brought and will continue to bring thanks to AI is not universally shared. And I speak from a fairly privileged position, because decades of research have shown that people and societies, be it in the so-called global north and global south, are unequal when it comes to accessing and making use of ICT. In fact, according to the ITU, 46% of the world population still cannot access internet. There's a persistent digital divide between, but also within countries that affect what people can really realistically expect and risk from the adoption of the latest advances of ICT, AI in particular. So with this session, we would like to bring to light the situation of countries and people that may not be on the right side of the digital divide. What opportunities and risk does the recent advances of AI generate for them? In what way can the advances of AI support or undermine the reduction of the digital gap? And more broadly, support or undermine economic and human development? Finally, how can we ensure that the disadvantaged countries and communities can effectively impact the development and governance of AI? So to explore these questions, we have with us 4 distinguished experts. Amandine Psingale, you were until recently Executive Director of the UN High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, which looked at the ways the international community could work together to make the most of digital technologies, AI included. Now you lead the International Digital Health and AI Research Project, IDARE in Geneva, which aims to harness digital technologies inclusively for universal health coverage. Karen Eo, you are Senior AI Editor for the MIT Technology Review, and you write about AI breakthroughs and the opportunities and risks they raise on a daily basis. Alexander Tsado, you co-founded Alliance for AI, which works across multiple fronts to develop AI expertise and businesses and advocate for African AI. And finally, Urvashi Aneja, you are the founding director of Tandem Research, and you recently published AI on the Ground, a snapshot of AI use in India, a report in which you discuss societal possibilities and risk associated with the use of AI in the Indian context. Thank you to all of you for taking the time to be with us today. So just a few words about the rules of the game for this session. So the spirit of the Stockholm Forum is that the discussion should be dialogue-based and solution-oriented. So no slide deck, no lengthy presentation. Let's try to keep the discussion as frank and interactive as possible. And I'll invite the audience to submit questions and discuss in the chat. I'll also do my best to include as many questions as possible in the discussion. So, to set the stage, I would like to turn first to Amandip Singhil and talk a bit about the opportunities and I invite you to reflect based on your past experience with the high-level panel on digital cooperation, but also your current position on AI and health. So bearing in mind that there's a lot of hype around AI, and it's easy to kind of overestimate its potential, what are for you the opportunities that the recent advances of AI bring for developing countries? And what do developing countries need or lack to be able to harness the progress that AI can bring for economic and human development? So the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Thank you to SIPRI for organizing this discussion. I'm glad to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. Now, with the UN SG's high-level panel, we did a survey of digital transformations, and I use plural transformation and not singular transformation deliberately on the ground in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and elsewhere, and found that these were seen as leapfrogging opportunities, and these were also seen as opportunities to think about existing problems, difficulties in the analog world in a different way. So more of an architectural approach to this. This contrasted quite a bit with the technology solutionism approach that you saw a lot in North America, in Western Europe. You know, technology will solve a lot of our problems on its own. And so there was this kind of an interesting contrast. And as a result of our reflections, the recommendation of the panel went into some of these enablers that could be globally understood. These common rails and guardrails that allow innovation to scale, but also guard against misuse, against exclusion, capacity development, governance. You mentioned the digital divide, but meaningful connectivity, not just being connected to the internet, but having agency over what you consume, what you interact with. And then most importantly, talking about AI and data, these new commons, which help us to think about the future differently. And I think this is the first time in history we have this opportunity to have a global conversation on something that could shape economies and societies for decades to come. We haven't had this historical opportunity before. So AI in part may be hype, but I think thinking about it meaningfully is not hype, is essential. So I'll conclude by just mentioning what IDEA aims to do, which is to be a kind of distributed CERN to allow the emerging geographies of innovation to make their mark on the research and development of these technologies, to develop an agenda together, to sift through the challenges, prioritize them, and not just privilege a few agenda items or few problems, or to have these divides of problem owners and solution makers. So it's in a way, I mean, in other fields you would call it decolonizing health, decolonize education, but this is about decolonizing research and development of cutting edge technologies. So I'll stop there, and I'd just say perhaps that SDGs, we have the 2030 target date and less than 10 years left. So this is the decade of action. If we get to those goals in time, we would need help. And digital technologies are certainly a tool in the box that we should not miss out.
Thank you. Thank you, Amandip, for this opening remarks. And I think it's a great way to start the conversation. So perhaps I would like to maybe turn to Alex Tsado and to maybe try to kind of get a more kind of a local or regional perspective on that issue. So the organization that you founded, Alliance for AI, works across multiple fronts to develop AI expertise and businesses in Africa. So obviously, Africa is a vast continent and with many countries that contain digital divides between and within them. So what opportunities do you see specifically in the African context? what do African nations need to make the most of AI innovation? And how do these need may differ from a country to another, but also within countries? So obviously speaking at a very general level, yeah, that would be interesting to get your view. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. First, I'll speak about how my views are kind of informed. On the technical side, I did work with NVIDIA. I was one of the few people on the product team that led launching the NVIDIA GPU, which is a central AI platform on all cloud platforms today. And then with Alliance for Africa's Intelligence, you just mentioned, we are helping build Africa's AI ecosystem, pretty much catalyzing the adoption of responsible AI on the continent. We have so far worked with governments on policy, education institutions on curriculum, and startups on use cases. And so I think it was about 2.5 years ago, we developed the first map of AI organizations on the continent, about 75 of them. And that was an incredible view. It was the first map that actually showed African organizations in AI on a page. And so that started to inform the likes of UNICEF, the AI for Good Foundation on how to think about AI in Africa. So with that kind of like data and research, I've seen AI being used for many different things on the continent, almost as opportunistically as it's been used in the West, you know, under capitalist values. But with our direction, I'm most excited about using the technology to create opportunities that can help us build around the infrastructure gaps the continent has. Quite similarly to what Amandip was talking about, you know, when he describes leapfrogging. Just for context, the African continent, by estimates, the African continent needs about $100 billion every year to plug the infrastructure gaps it has. And so if we use AI properly, if we use this tool, like AI doesn't use itself, you don't have to use AI to only sell marketing tools. If we use AI properly, we can reduce that $100 billion by orders of magnitude. Some example can be, say in the health space, which you did mention earlier, you know, there are diseases that you can use AI to detect, to diagnose. And so if you know, as a government, you supported an entrepreneur that was able to develop AI tools on a phone, it can then pass that phone to, say, healthcare service providers in villages and create tens of thousands of jobs for them while providing healthcare to hundreds of thousands of people that you previously could not reach because you didn't have enough doctors. So I could pause there and share more later, but that's how at least our organization is thinking about the opportunities on the continent.
Thank you so much, Alex. So perhaps before we talking about the risk picture, maybe I want to turn to Karen and Urvashi on whether you also want to chip in on the question of opportunities that you see for development. Would like any of you to like to react to what Amandine and Alex just said?
I would just like to say that hearing about some of the opportunities that both of you are seeing through your research is heartening to me, because I spend most of my time as a journalist covering the harms of AI technology. So it's exciting to see that there are lots of already ongoing projects and opportunities that are really taking a different approach than what I see as the more problematic approach of the US and US tech giants. Yeah, so I appreciate both of you sharing your expertise on that.
Thank you, Karen.
I can chime in there. I mean, ditto to what Karen is saying, right? Most of my research often focuses on diagnosing the problems really well. So it's great to hear that there are, you know, these glimmers of positive change that we see happening. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we struggle with talking about the opportunities is also because we use the wrong phrasing when we're talking about AI. The term AI is mostly a marketing tool. What we're really talking about is pretty sophisticated computational statistics. And statistics, as we all know, what it tends to do is that it compresses information and it kind of gravitates towards a median value, right? And it leaves out the outliers, it leaves out what's on the edge. Now, that's not to say that statistics are not powerful or they're not important. They're hugely powerful and they can play a huge role in bringing about development gains. But we have to start by separating out what you said in the beginning, Vincent, of separating out the hype around AI to what is actually happening. And if we look at what is actually happening, we might find many more opportunities than Karen and I might encounter in our work currently.
Thank you, Urvashi and Karen. I think it's a good segue into the second segment of that discussion, where I wanted to kind of also focus on what you just said about the risk. So maybe starting with you, Karen. So you, as you said, you are a journalist and you cover AI development on a daily basis. So what do you perceive as being the biggest risk in the field of AI today? And how often, if at all, do you see that the discourse around this risk affect the situation and needs of developing countries?
I think the biggest risk that I see is really the dramatic concentration of power in the hands of a few. And that is specifically in the way that what Urvashi was saying, we need to be sort of precise when we talk about AI. As we're talking about, as at least the way that I'm using AI right now, it's really referring to deep learning, which is the current cutting edge technique within the field that has created this dramatic power gap. The reason why is because deep learning is extremely computationally intensive and resource intensive, and there are very, very few people in the world, or very, very few companies in the world, that actually have access to that amount of computational power and resources at their disposal. And so what's happening is we're seeing these extremely privileged, wealthy companies based in the wealthiest countries that are really, they have all of the computational power, they have all of the power of decision making for how this technology can be developed and deployed. They have all of the knowledge about what they actually did to build this technology and what the limitations might be. And then they end up reaping all of the benefits. And vice versa, in contrast, we then have marginalized communities, whether that's marginalized communities within countries or developing countries across borders, that end up suffering a loss of privacy, that end up getting surveilled, have a lack of agency, suffer discrimination, like all of these things that I sort of cover and that you sort of see in the news, where there's it's just the gap of the haves and have-nots are becoming so vast. And my worry constantly is that it's difficult for us to change the situation when we do have such a concentration of knowledge and know-how and resources within one group. And my hope, to be a bit more optimistic, is that we can sort of move away from the deep learning model and be more innovative. And I hope that developing countries can play a big role in this, be more innovative in developing techniques that actually do not have the particular characteristics of deep learning in its consumption of power, and actually develop more techniques that are more energy efficient, more resource efficient, but also actually, oftentimes we don't actually need deep learning to tap into some of the opportunities that Alex and Amandeep were talking about. So develop more techniques that really address the true problems on the ground, rather than the theoretical things that have intrigued more privileged scientists in wealthy countries.
Thank you so much, Karen. So, I mean, I think it's a great point about this, the risk of the centralization of power, and the fact that it might actually exacerbate to some extent the pre-existing digital divide between countries and also within countries. So, so before turning to Urvashi and maybe talk about the concrete, the Indian example, I just wanted to kind of invite maybe Amandeep and perhaps Alex to just reflect on what Karen just said.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's why we need to climb up the knowledge-making value chain to where the agendas are set. I mean, machine learning is one way of doing AI. It is currently the dominant strain in a sense. We're talking of viral strain at this point in time, but there could be others in the future. And we've seen in other fields as well how dominant epistemic communities start to dominate a field. In the nuclear domain, for example, the Cambridge community around arms control came together in the 1950s, and a certain paradigm was created. And it's the same with AI. I think in our work, daily work, we see that there is this interest in the paper to digital and the digital to data and AI transformation. So where does a particular context fit? Making informed choices about that is that kind of understanding is needed, and we need people to facilitate that type of understanding, rather than joining the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons in this narrow domain where large compute capacities, humongous data sets, and tens of thousands of engineers matter. The beauty of AI is that it's about problem solving. It's about what is called in India jugaad. So a bit of tinkering and bringing together unusual suspects around the problem. So I think that is where the competitive advantage for those who are facing this asymmetry of data power and AI power lies.
Thank you, Amandit, for this insight. Alex would like to chip in on this before I turn to Urvashi.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very interesting point. I have read some of your works, Karen and Urvashi on the risks, and they're really scary. I've seen them myself. It's exactly why I got scared into creating Alliance for AI three and a half years ago. I mean, a top 5 risk in the space of AI is a lack of diversity, and Africans have to play a role. Swedes have to play a role. When historians like Yuval Noah speak, they open our eyes to the fact that humans are beginning to build tools that give them godlike powers, right? Like we're combining, for those who are new to the AI space, it's sort of like we're combining the physical world and the digital world and then the biological world to help us, start to create things that we thought only God could create, right? Like deciding what children get born with AI in IVF, what people healthcare is going to work for, what people are going to get arrested by the police. There are several really big use cases that, when built by just one group of people in the world, can be very problematic and provide harm to everyone else. And so when I then connect this to, say, the African continent, in Africa, the African continent is very different in terms of where it is at, in terms of infrastructure and resources to spend on this. Most African countries don't have $50 million to spend on a supercomputer, like I see happen all the time in the US. But what we definitely have, what Alliance for AI has found, is that there are at least 10 countries that have more than 10,000 data scientists in them. So as someone in government, how can you empower those 10,000 to build expertise in artificial intelligence for 2 reasons? The first one is that they become experts and informed so that they can inform policy that will protect, your future, the future of your children. You can't escape this. And then the second one, of course, is then to use AI to create large opportunities like I talked about earlier. That's how I'm thinking about the technology.
Thank you, Alex. So perhaps I would like to turn to you, Urvashi. So as I said in my introduction, you quoted the report called AI on the Ground, a snapshot of AI use in India. And you covered many of the potential harm of AI through different sectors. So what are the biggest risks of AI for a country like India? And are they reflexive of the issues that Karen and Amandit and Alex have talked about so far? And how would you, if you were to kind of like nuance them in the Indian context, what would you say?
Thanks, Vincent. You've asked me so many questions, I could go on forever. So I have to kind of make sure that I keep my remarks pretty brief. I mean, I just want to say one, that I'm so happy to hear that we're actually, I mean, the point that Karen made, right, that we're actually pushing back as deep learning being the end of AI. Some of my favorite AI scientists call this current phase that we are in as the great AI nap, right? Where we're stuffing in a lot of data while someone's sleeping, and then you hope that while they're dreaming, there's like this amazing magical answer that comes out, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So we are really at an early stage, and we must be open to exploring this field in a much deeper way. So it's really good to hear that. In terms of what we see in the Indian context, right? I mean, let me pick up from maybe where Karen left off about the centralization of power. I think what we see that in the Indian context, right? We see a dominance of big tech actors in the Indian context. I think one of the differences that we see or one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about big tech in the Indian context is that a lot of these big tech actors are actually filling gaps in state capacity. They're filling gaps in market capacity, and they actually have a tremendous amount of civic power in these contexts, right? So that makes that centralization of power even more critical, and the need for that accountability from that centralization of power even more important. And there is a jurisdictional issue which challenges the extent to which you can hold them accountable, right? So in the US, for an example, when Trump was active on social media in ways that the American public did not like, Facebook took a very active stand, right? But we had similar kind of things happening in the Indian context on many previous elections, and that similar kind of position was not taken, right? So that's, just to pick up on what Karen was saying. But I think the other kind of 2-3 things that really stand out to me as being unique or different is there is a certain imagination about AI. There is a certain association of AI as a marker of progress, as a marker of modernity, as something in the future, right? So there's a strong narrative that India must catch up with the future, that we missed the boat on previous industrial revolution. So therefore we cannot afford to miss the boat on this industrial revolution, on the 4th industrial revolution. So there's this very strong imaginary of AI being that future, right? We don't know what's really there, but we know it's the future and we want to get there. And we think that somehow getting there is going to help us address all of the other very complex and intractable socioeconomic problems, right? And that imagination is actually really powerful, because what that imagination does is 2 really big things. One is that I think we see in the Indian context, the state is one of the biggest promoters of the use of AI, right? And not only for the use of AI for new market efficiencies or innovation, but as it being a really critical part of modern India's development story, right? As being critical to the state building, nation building project of India. And that means the stakes are also very different, right? So it's not just being pushed by the private sector, it's being pushed by the state. The other thing that I think this imagination does of AI being the future is that you have a lot of private sector actors who are selling a lot of untested, unverified, not safe solutions to the state, right? And the state is buying them because there's this association that this is the future, right? And I think it might sound like a more obtuse kind of point, but I think thinking about that tells you a lot about how the political economy of this space is playing out in the Indian context. I think the other big thing that is different about the Indian context, and it's the same with many other countries in the global south, is that there's very weak institutional and regulatory capacity. Right, so India, for an example, still doesn't have a data protection framework. We don't have a data protection authority. So the institutional and regulatory capacity you need to steer AI trajectories, right, to be able to harness AI for societal good is fragmented or lacking. And equally, and this is the point that I think Amandeep was making earlier, there's also weak knowledge capacities, right? So one of the reasons we see this pushback against AI in the US, in the United Kingdom, is because that pushback has come from civil society. There's been a long tradition of research. There's been a long tradition of engagement between academic institutions and the policy community. And that has allowed civil society in the US to highlight these issues, and not just highlight them in abstract terms, but through concrete empirical evidence. So right now in the Indian context, we're using examples of like the compass system in the US to make an argument about how the use of AI in the criminal justice system could result or contribute to discriminatory practices, right? That's not a very effective way to do advocacy, right? That's not the best way to try and convince a policymaker that, hey, there's something that you need to pay attention to. So building that knowledge capacity, building that civil society capacity, so that civil society in these spaces can draw their own red lines, can draw their own green lines, right, is really crucial. And till we don't do that, the ask that Amandeep is talking about decolonizing AI, we're not there, right? So right now, the interesting thing is that the decolonizing AI conversation is still being had in northern industrialized economies. You don't hear that language in the global south, right? In the global south, you still hear about AI as the magic bullet, as techno-solutionism, as providing that silver bullet that is going to address all our problems, right? So I think thinking about institutional capacity, thinking about the role of AI in the context of development trajectories is what is different about the global south. There are numerous other issues around privacy and data bias and discrimination, and we could nuance them further to the Indian context, but the broad contours of those are the same.
Thank you, Urvashi. I mean, you made some very interesting points, and I think I really like especially the point about the fact that maybe perhaps in the global north and global south, to be very simplistic, there's the narrative, or at least the conversation, is at different stage, and that connects to the question of knowledge, where perhaps there's this tendency to see this kind of AI solutionism is stronger in the global south, because in the north there have been a progress in the conversation where that narratives are being questioned. So I think that's a very actually very interesting point for us. So now I'd like perhaps to go back to Karen, and I don't know if you want to kind of reflect on some of the points that Urvashi and Alex and Amandeep raised, and perhaps then we can move into a conversation more about actually the governance aspect of this issue.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. Yeah, I think the points that Urvashi made are really important, and it's interesting because I think there actually are a lot of parallels in the US, even though the US it hypothetically is supposed to be further along in the conversation around what AI is and what its limitations are. What's interesting is, I mean, within the US, we do have like a very rich community of scholars who are critiquing AI and critiquing techno-solutionism and bringing to the fore these examples that Urvashi was talking about, like the compass system in the US and the discriminatory behaviors of AI. At the same time, there's other communities that are really focused on this belief that AI can in a way help the US retain its global supremacy, because obviously the US is sort of slipping away from its previous role as a global leader. It's very nervous about that, and a lot of conversations that happen in the policy and defense world is about, we need to really invest in this technology to continue having these capabilities and make sure that we don't get overtaken by China. It's always like, we need to use AI as the tool for reinforcing American democracy around the world, because if we do not do that, then Chinese AI is going to take over, and Chinese AI is not built with democratic values. And so there is still so much parallel with what Urvashi is saying in what she's hearing in the Indian context, where AI, in certain circles, AI is still equal to progress, it's still equal to supremacy, it's still equal to so many of the things that other critical scholars are trying to disassociate with. And yeah, I just wanted to add that one point, that I do feel like in a lot of, not just in the US, but in Europe as well, there is that persistence of that conversation that AI is going to still bring us into the future somehow.
Thank you, Karen. Amandeep and Alex, perhaps we want to react to what we just heard.
I think these points are important, but it's a global affliction. I mean, James Scott wrote about seeing like a state. These big schemes to improve the human condition. We've seen it, nuclear space, subaltern science versus big science. You see this in Europe, where I sit these days. The conversation in Brussels is about the fear of missing out. We are being left behind. So we need to think big. Infrastructure, even the thinking about regulation is very, very top down. Let's fix it from the top. So we'll come to governance where, Vincent, you know about my thinking on distributed governance, about layered governance, and looking at AI, not just as AI, but there is the data side and there is the statistical literacy side. Basically, how do you contextualize this? And we've seen this in the examples of some recent failures in the UK around this education algorithm, Stanford, the vaccines rollout. So if you don't get these three different pieces together, then you really can't appreciate how the governance should work. So I think we have a problem, and it's a global problem, that this is becoming more like a big science issue, whereas AI should be a small meso science type of an issue. So we need to, there is this imbalance that we need to look at. Karen's point about what's shifting in the US, and I was very glad to read recently Feifei telling her students that go follow the doctors, see how they talk to their patients. Just don't look for big data sets. So there is this, but I think we need to push this a little more.
Thank you, Amanda, for putting this into a broader perspective. I think you're very correct. Alex, do you want to add anything before I turn back to Karen again?
Yeah, definitely. It's wow. We're in a very. I listened to the comments of my fellow panelists, and we're informed that we're in a very dicey time. We're in a time for wisdom. We're in a time to think broadly about trade-offs, right? Like listeners should recognize that this is not like any other time. This is a very new time for us to really think. Most of us are kind of informed, but we actually don't even know where to go with this information that we have. Two quick facts are that fact number one, expertise in AI is going to give you efficiencies that will help you overpower others. So as Urvashi speaks, the folks in India are not wrong when they say you absolutely need AI to get into the future. That's just point fact. But then the second fact is that AI, by giving these efficiencies, a way to translate it is that it gives, say, 10 people the power to do what you used to need 10,000 people to do before. And so by that fact, it is anti-democratic, the way we think of democracy today. And so when you are adopting AI for these efficiencies because you want to overpower other nations, you want to think about geopolitics, be aware that you're going to be knocking down your democracy unless you rethink what democracy is, unless you rethink institutions that are going to kind of guide against that happening, right? The US is facing this. US is in no way leading this. I was just a month ago part of a very big research that looked at the US, Europe, and the leadership of all the top companies in the world, discussing how this is, front and center of their thinking about this decade and how this could lead things to crumble, right? And so I wonder with the panelists, what do you think are tangible solutions, these double-edged sort of AI? In my view, the quick one I at least thought about last month was really that we have to get the data scientists to accept that the things they are building are going to have social, economic implications. Right now, they completely refuse to accept that. They are not taught anything about this in school. It needs to be the first thing they learn before they learn how to use Python to build AI. But they refuse to accept it, from the data scientists to the CEOs of the largest companies, which I've been able to chat with. Nobody accepts that they have civil responsibility.
Thank you, Alex. I think it's a great segue into my next question, which was for Karen about in your writing, you have been pointing the problem with this concentration of power, and you have been saying that there's a need for democratizing AI development. So I just wonder whether you could perhaps develop a bit more about that, and what model do you see for empowering AI development in developing countries or in some communities that might not be advantaged in that context?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I sort of want to say is that I think it's really important for us to decouple technological progress from social progress. I think one of the reasons why we have encountered AI creating so much harm is because we assume that a technical advancement in AI is going to somehow bring us to more economic or social prosperity. And that is not always the case. You know, like we now have extremely advanced facial recognition systems, and that is not in fact bringing us any kind of social prosperity around the world. It's in fact being used to target protesters around the world, in the US and Hong Kong, in India, and it's being used to falsely arrest Black people in the US because police somehow believe that this is a superior technology that can help them identify criminals, and then the technology absolutely fails because a lot of it's snake oil, and then they end up infringing fundamentally on the human rights of innocent people. And so I think that's number one, is there needs to be like a cultural shift or like a narrative shift, or whatever you want to call it, away from this myth that technological progress equates with social progress. In terms of like how to actually democratize AI development, I mean, I don't think anyone really has good answers to this. But what I mean when I say that is that there really needs to be a much broader array of people that are at the table when technology gets developed and when it gets regulated. And by that, I mean, there needs to be more diversity of countries represented, more diversity of genders, races, ethnicities, interdisciplinary diversity. And it also needs to not just be among scholars and experts, but also among the public as well, because the public, they're the ones that are ultimately subjected to these technologies. They need to be able to contribute their knowledge and their wisdom of how this technology can actually benefit them on the ground. It shouldn't be just experts sitting in a room imagining how we might build this technology to help these people. And I think what Alex was saying is right, is that part of the way to get there is to actually is the education level. Like we really need to focus on educating our citizens in a new way in the future. Like right now, you know, I very strongly feel that for a long time, because of like the way that the Industrial Revolution happened, there's become this splinter where you can either focus on tech and be like a tech person, or you can focus on the humanities and be a humanities person. And that model of education that we've had and brought from our past is no longer applicable in the digital, when we're dealing with digital technologies, because algorithms, AI, these like supposedly technical things are completely fundamentally rewiring many of the social contracts within our society. So in order to actually develop these technologies properly, we need people that are educated in both and that have that nuanced understanding, and then recognize that we should be bringing many more people to the table to do it right. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Karen, for stressing the importance of, especially the importance of education for democratization of AI. So perhaps if we are trying to kind of turn to a more kind of like policy action level, so what perhaps states in the global south can do, I'd like to turn back to you, Urvashi. So AI is a kind of a large middle income country with a growing tech economy. So what are for you the tools that India have to guide the development of AI technologies to their benefit and away from the possible harm? And in what way do you think that India can be helping, you know, or engaging on the AI governance issue at the international level?
Well, I just want to echo what Karen was saying. The education part of it, the civil society part of it is really, really critical. I feel we have to be careful, though, that we're not shifting the goalpost too much. There's, like you said in your opening remarks, 55% of the world is still not even on the internet. So the catch up that we're asking for as a way to democratize a technology that is being produced by a select few actors might be an unfair ask in the first place. That being said, I think one of the issues with the governance conversation, or the way I would like to move the governance conversation forward, is to start connecting the AI governance conversation with what is happening in kind of social justice movements and social justice places. These two conversations normally happen very far apart. So you have some people talking about tech and someone else who's talking about all the other kind of social justice issues, right? And I think we have to start drawing those connections, because that's where we will be able to create that safe, ethical, meaningful, rights respecting AI. And you'd ask me about what India can bring to the table in terms of the global conversation about AI governance. At this stage, I don't see too much that India is putting on the table for that conversation that I think is going to move the conversation forward in a meaningful way. From the policy and state level, we have a draft national strategy. We have a few kind of documents floating around responsible AI that deserve a lot more kind of attention. But I think there's something really interesting happening in the social movement space in India that can provide us anchors to think about the governance conversation. And I'll just quickly mention them, right? And it's obviously a much longer conversation. Farmers have been protesting in India for the past couple of months, as some of you might know. And without getting into whether, the agriculture should be privatized or not privatized, one of the core issues that the farmers were protesting about was that they were not involved in decision-making about themselves, right? They wanted a seat at the table when decisions were being made about themselves. You also have gig workers protesting in India right now, right? About the unfair terms of an Uber and Ola, which is the Indian version of Ola. You have development agencies who make claims that like, hey, these people were in informal labor before, that informal labor was very exploitative. At least now they get some form they're improving their earnings. But the point is that if you look at these protests, what they're telling you is that people know that there's a hugely unequal distribution of technology gains, right? So we need to take that labor question very, very seriously. The third movement that you see happening in India is around citizenship. And again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but what that movement tells you is that people have multiple identities, people have complex identities, and are uncomfortable when their identity is reduced to a single marker, right? So that's the third one. And there's a fourth movement that is worth noting, which is the youth movement around climate change and environmental action, right? And what they're telling us is that future generations matter, the environment matters, we are not outside of the environment. We have to take that into cognizance in our technology development. So these 4 points around agency, identity, labor, and the environment, that's what I think needs to be the crux of a future governance agenda if AI is going to be delivering good and social development and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Urvashi, for this very concrete suggestion. So perhaps now I would like to kind of turn to Alex and maybe try to contrast with your perspective from the African continent. So so you have been involved in different processes. So do you think that it's important to kind of perhaps support more Pan-African collaboration in this area? And what do you see as important to enabling a counterpoint in Africa to the current dominance of AI actors like from the global north?
Definitely. Before I answer that question directly in terms of Pan-Africanism and things like that, I will quickly kind of add on what Urvashi just chatted about. I think someone should write an article on the top 3 challenges on AI. And I say a lot of article writers on the call. I think they're pretty similarly. First one is job losses. Second one is harm and bias. Third one is the anti-democratic push that it brings, right? On job losses side, it's that, yes, AI is going to automate a lot of jobs, but it's going to create opportunities for new jobs. But then those new jobs, people are not being trained to take on those new jobs. So it's hard. So you're going to have millions who will lose jobs. I mean, McKinsey says over 70 million people by 2030 in the US alone will lose their jobs, So this is huge. Second one is harm and bias. We've talked about a lot on this call. Anti-democratism, we've talked about a lot on this call. And so based on this, when we have worked with different African institutions like the government of South Africa, the Smart Africa initiative that was trying to draft Africa's AI blueprint, we've brought forward these kind of challenges to their front, and thankfully they've written in policy that tries to help with these things, but nothing is perfect, right? Where they've thought about, all right, to combat the job loss, how can there be sort of, or rather to combat harm and bias, how can there be diversity of people who are present when technology is getting built, or how can the people who are building get educated, like Karen said, in not just technology, but on the social side of things. Like, it has to be both, right? And then, as AI is automating all jobs away, how are you training people to leverage the new capabilities that they're going to need to have? And finally, with that anti-democratic force that it brings in, how are you coming up with new guidance to share the acquired power? The acquired power that is being acquired today is not being shared, right? In my view, Zuckerberg is the greatest king on the planet, and nobody is taking note of that, right? He controls a country of 2 billion people, and it will be 3 or 4 billion people soon. And with the snap of his fingers, he can shut down the US president, okay? Right. So with African nations, through the Africa Union, through Smart Africa initiative, they are trying to come together to write policies together. Those policies have been written. What's next now is how they're going to drive it to implementation. I'm quite hopeful. I hope they can do that. They can convince other nations to leverage this almost central blueprint that has been written to then write, recommendations that work particularly well for their own countries. It's a whole process. This is early days, but we'll see where it will go. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn back to Amandip, and so as I outlined in my introduction, so you have been involved in numerous international processes around AI. So I would like to focus more on the role of international organizations such as the UN, but also perhaps the ITU as well. So what concrete actions do you think could be taken to democratize AI, to ensure better inclusiveness and diversity in AI governance? And what obstacle do you see to the development of international efforts in that area?
I think we have a higher awareness of the potential for good and also the potential for harm. The Secretary General himself has taken a leading position on lethal autonomous weapon systems, for example. But you also see concrete initiatives going beyond principles and moral positions. So I've been involved with the UNESCO work on the recommendation on AI ethics, which is fairly detailed and goes into ways to implement ethical guidance. The OECD work on AI principles, which has now been multilateralized with the G20. So there is good work being done, but I think we still have a surfeit of abstraction. So we need more concrete cases, and we need more of a dynamic between the edge and the center on governance solutions. So there needs to be more innovation in governance. International organizations sometimes have a tendency to prematurely declare consensus on something. So we need to keep things more open, lower the bar to participation in governance discussions internationally from more actors, and bring more concrete examples and the purpose of regulatory discussions or governance discussions in international organizations should not be to point fingers, country X, country Y, you can't get this right, or, these governments are not, capable of thinking about AI in a democratic way, but to make the use possible in ways that respect human rights, etc. So if you just point fingers and don't talk about better use or, exchange of innovations around enablers, then things are not going to be. Finally, I think this point about literacy, governance, these are very important enablers, but let's not forget basic infrastructure. And it's not just about connectivity, it's about some of the tools being available more democratically. And this is not just compute tools. So if you want to do AI with molecular science. You need access to genomic sequencing in a democratic way. In Africa, I know it costs many times more to do one sequence than in the US. In India, somewhere in between. But if you don't bring the costs of doing these things down to $5, $10 per test, then how do you build the data sets around particular AI use cases? So the infrastructure conversation is very, very important.
Thank you, Amandip. We have only a few minutes left, and I would like to kind of like maybe use them as a way to kind of round up the discussion. And I would like to invite you, each of the speakers, to kind of perhaps share one or two takeaways from that conversation. That was we managed to cover a lot of ground within 15 minutes. So perhaps, I mean, on my side, I would stress that my takeaway from this conversation is that it's clear that AI has potential for development, but it should not be overestimated, and it's important not to fall into this kind of the pitfall of AI solutionism, and important that there can't be like a technological fix to some of the challenges, and in fact a lot of the potential that AI has depend on also the previous evolution of ICT technologies, and the fact that there are pre-existing digital divide that. And if we are not careful, that the divide could actually be exacerbated over time due to a lack of skill, knowledge, or infrastructure also. So this will be the key, one of the key takeaways from this conversation. So now I'd like to perhaps turn in reverse order, like Urvashi first, and then Karen, and then Alex, and then Amandip.
Sure. I think my biggest takeaway and is just the kind of, I'm so happy to see how this conversation has shifted in such a short period of time. I think even about 3-4 years ago, a panel like this, we were still trying to make the case that there are risks, and we're trying to make the case that there is something called bias and there is exclusion, and these things don't magically go away. And I'm really happy to see that starting point has shifted, right? That we're able to now actually explore, okay, what could a non-deep learning model look like, or how do we democratize AI? So I think there's a lot of hope in that. Thank you.
It's funny. My takeaway is very complimentary, and I sort of am realizing that we need to spend more time really emphasizing that and bringing that home, because a lot of those conversations can be had right now in wealthier contexts where we already have very advanced AI, whereas as Urvashi was saying, in India, there's still such a strong association of AI as the future and AI as the way to catch up. And so I think my takeaway is that I need to do a better job of acknowledging that in my reporting, and kind of thinking about how do you speak to that audience when there is such a deep-seated narrative around that.
Thank you, Karen. Alex?
Yeah, from my end, my takeaway, and the one I'm hoping people grasp from this, is that AI is like a toy, right? You receive a toy, and like a child, you use the toy opportunistically to just beam, shoot everywhere, right? And do everything with it. And that's the phase that we've been in with AI, where we've just used it for marketing and use it to make billions of dollars, and we're so excited about it. I hope that what you take now is that we are now at the point where we need to be adults. We need to take a pause and understand, what we're doing with that toy, and be more purposeful with it. We can use AI to truly transform the planet. I've seen AI we have deployed in the fastest supercomputers be used to better predict when earthquakes are going to happen, better simulate what will happen with climate change. AI has helped us come up with medication or vaccines for COVID faster. There are great things that can be done with technology, but we just have to be more purposeful with it. If we continue to use it like a toy, we're going to destroy the planet.
Thank you for this good analogy. Amandip, do you have the last word?
I am happy to follow Alex. I think we need these moonshots, these big challenges. Let's take a global pandemic surveillance and management scheme, which is digitally enabled, which is AI powered, that brings data from usual and unusual sources together. but which is put together collaboratively and which is backed by a neutral and trusted infrastructure into which researchers from across the world can plug in. So if we can get something like that right, all the way from governance and benchmarking to the data coming together in real time, then we can perhaps get AI right in most other areas. So let's focus on a few of these moonshots.
Thank you to all of you. The time is up. So thank you to all of you for taking the time to be with us and share your expertise on that topic. I personally learned a lot, and I hope that all the participants also took away some important lessons. And I hope that conversation will carry forward. There were a lot of great suggestions that were made. So hopefully that will contribute to a better use of AI in the development context. So thank you again, and I wish you a good continuation to participation in the forum, the rest of the forum. So goodbye.